by asking each of you to describe a little bit about your own personal journey getting to this point. So maybe I'll start with you, Michael. You know, as an economist, you could have gone in any number of different directions, many of which would probably have paid you much better. Why did you choose the local economy, you personally?
Right, well, it was not just avoiding economics, but it was also avoiding law school. You know, so I got my law degree and then can't continue to do this. And it was upon law school graduation that I gave my mother the degree, and I said the career is for me. And I guess I would define my own journey through life, and there were experiences early on that led to this, is constantly trying to figure out how do you take the global and make it relevant to the local, to community. And for the first 15 years or so of my professional life, I organized mayors and city council members to get them involved in what I call municipal foreign policy. So that was divestment from South Africa, sister cities with controversial places. And then I gradually started to pay attention to what cities were doing in North-South economic development cooperation, which I thought was really interesting. But then I realized that all of them had great ideas on how to do it and no coherent economic theory or practice. And that's when I realized I cannot continue to work internationally and inflict this kind of pain and suffering which economists are prone to do unless I figure it out in my own backyard. So that's what set me off on working on the local piece and figuring out what's working in the United States, and finally, now I feel I see enough of similar examples internationally that I can feel a little more at ease in working on the global front.
Thank you. Maya, how about you? You come from a community in Nigeria, and you're teaching in a university.
Yes.
So you span that whole range of experiences.
Yes.
Tell me about how you got interested in this localization movement.
Okay. Before I do that, I'd just like to, since Dick started off, initiate everyone here. Well, let me start by saying that it's not every time that I travel that I get to feel at home in a new space or a new place. It's cold, yes, but I still feel warm. Portland has a feel and a communal thing about it, so I just want to say thank you for welcoming us, and it's a beautiful city to be in. Yes, I think you're correct. So just before I start, the Yoruba people in Western Nigeria, just before anything happens, they say, they invite an audience into a storytelling context. And the way they do that is to say, hello, and the audience replies, hello. So I'm just going to do that right now. Say, hello. Hello. Beautiful. Just make it go down just a little bit more. So once more. Hello. Hello. Awesome. So give yourself a round of applause for that. Well, I teach in a university. I'm a clinical psychologist, and for my work involves trying to understand healing contexts from different parts of Nigeria and how people think about healing, what it means to be well and what it means to be ill. And the way I was trained in a very Eurocentric paradigm, was that healing is something that takes place between a professional who is distant and a client, a shrink, basically shrink. I have to stay aloof, and the client has to obey my instructions or thereabout. And I felt disenchanted with that story, and so I looked for, are there ancient ways, are there indigenous means that we've constructed a story of healing that could appeal to us now? Because research is actually showing that people are turning away from traditional ways of conducting or constructing psychotherapy. And I encountered shaman priests in Western Nigeria who taught me about the spirits and that the world is alive and that stones and rocks have consciousness and that we can't really boil everything down to pills and DSM manuals and we can't shrink and reduce everything that way. that there are ways of being alive that we've lost. And until we find our way back into the dark, we will continue to be lost, so to speak. And well, that brought me into the localization movement in terms of, I started to question what other territories are we being denied entry into, access into? How can we revive our own ways of being alive in the world? And that's what brought me into this place.
Thank you. There's another story, but if you could just tell us an epiphany, a moment where your view sort of shifted about where you think the nexus of our hopes lie.
Well, so complicated because it is to do with the wholeness of experiencing a whole society that was living completely differently from all the industrial cultures that I knew. And I had grown up in Sweden, but studied in England and in Germany and in America, and I studied languages in different countries. And I thought all those countries were very different. And I traveled to places like Mexico and Turkey and Africa. But I had only traveled there, so I hadn't been exposed to just another world, the way I was when I came to a place called Ladakh or in Tibet in 1975. I was a linguist. I was meant to go to help make a film and spend 6 weeks there before returning to Paris, where I was working as a linguist. And then I just suddenly was exposed to this other whole world that had not been affected by colonialism or development. They'd been sealed off in the modern era, and I had never ever encountered people who looked so healthy and so happy and so vital. And it's been a difficult thing because now for 40 years I've tried to often tell this story, and it's even sometimes for me hard to believe that the Ladakhis had managed so well without all these things that we think have so improved life. And my message is not that we need to go back to that pre-industrial way of life, but that there is just a huge amount we can learn about where technology and progress might actually be really helpful and where it isn't. And so for me it was that was the sort of epiphany of getting to know this culture, seeing how overnight in the name of growth and development, unemployment was created and never existed before. Never ever existed unemployment. So I started questioning this whole economic system back then, and I read Shuman's book, Small is Beautiful, when I was in Ladakh, and that gave me the audacity to write to the Indian government and say, look, economists are saying we need to take a different approach, and to realize that very often small businesses and small human-scaled units can actually be more productive, be more efficient, and both more ecological and more in tune with human needs.
And that's what we're going to be discussing all this weekend. Thank you.
But I would also like to say that Manish and I we had all talked before. We hadn't managed to get it planned, but we really want everyone here to have a chance to speak. And so we're thinking of taking just 5 minutes for people to turn to the person behind them and maybe just tell them why they've come.
Let's first hear from Manish.
Yeah, and then we do that.
Sure,
before we
that
have
sounds
discussion.
great.
Yeah, thank you.
So I've had a very strange journey. Many incarnations I've lived through in the last 45 years. I wanted to, since I was a kid, I wanted to do something really good in the world, and so that led me into all kinds of strange places. As an investment banker on Wall Street, Harvard academic, a UN, UNESCO official, educationist there, and as I got into it, I became more and more disillusioned by the linear, standardized, rational ways of thought, the PowerPoint presentations, and the Excel sheets and all of that. And I just entered into very deep disillusionment and despair and hopelessness around experts and what what they were telling the world, and very deep sadness that most people were believing or putting their lives in trust of all of these experts around the planet. And so I left all of that and I went and spent time with my illiterate village grandmother and started to see that there was an entire different world out there of how to see and relate to each other and to life on the planet. And since then I have been trying to work on regenerating and reconnecting to people's knowledge systems, most of them which our formal education has devalued or dismissed or tried to destroy. So a lot of our work is around doing that. I think that's a really big part of the localization movement, is to bring in lots of different ways of knowing which have been made invisible over the last couple of 100 years.
Right.
One of the things that I've always been very struck by in Portland is the local food movement. So I want to ask Michael to talk a little bit about why food so often tends to be right at the center of the work we do on localization.
Well, the obvious answer is that anything that tastes good is going to be a winner, politically. And there's something about local food that brings us together socially and aesthetically that you just don't quite get with alternative banking or local currency. But I think there's another reason for food too. I mean, food is the most basic economy. Economies historically grew up around food, and as we became self-reliant in food, we then could sort of begin to morph into other kinds of economic activities. So getting food right, I think, is a great starting place. And the last thing I would say is that, I mean, many of us are driven by a bunch of motives to be involved in local food. It's good for our health, it's good for our relationships, it's good for our economy, but what people don't appreciate is that the global food system is terribly uneconomic. It is grotesque. It has really cheap production costs, but unbelievably expensive distribution costs. And if you look at a typical dollar of foodstuff, back in the year 1900, 40 cents went to the farmer, and the rest went to inputs and marketing. And today it's 7 cents, and something like 79 cents goes for all kinds of distribution, and that's transportation, value adding, insurance, energy, wholesale, and then retail markup. These are all inefficiencies in the system that localization gets rid of.
So every time, yes, I think we've sort of done one story in each of the main new innovation categories on local food. I discovered something new that I hadn't heard about. And I'm just wondering if there's one story that you're particularly excited about right now with local food that's kind of taking us the next step.
Yes. My favorite story with local food is that in 1998, the province of Nova Scotia passed a law that made it possible for grassroots groups to create their own investment funds. And Nova Scotia is a province of about 1 million people. Since then, 65 of these funds have been formed. People put their pension funds inside of it, and nearly all of these funds are focused on farmers and local food businesses. And if we in the United States had as many of these funds per capita, we would have 21,000.
Manish, I want to talk to you about education. Here in the Northwest, we hear a lot about India's high tech and how much, there's a lot, especially up in the Seattle area where I live now, there's a lot of people going back and forth between Bangalore and Redmond, Washington. And you're thinking about education in a very different way. And I'm just curious how you think about it and whether it's, you're observing other people in your communities that are also interested in the approach you're taking rather than the high-tech, globalized corporate future.
So, our stance on education actually starts from a very basic question of who do we consider educated and who is uneducated. And I think, our stance on education starts with this very basic question of who is educated and who is uneducated. And I think that's where I grew up being told my grandmother was uneducated and I was educated, or all of my ancestors have been uneducated and I'm the only one who's educated. And that, for me, actually created lots of, existential problems. What does that actually mean? How do I see all of, there's a term in India, for example, that's used a lot by educationists called first-generation learners. So this is what the first kids who go to school are called first-generation learners. And so that means that we have basically, as soon as we sign up for that, we have agreed that we have no knowledge, no history, no culture, no learning that has been happening for the last, thousands of years. And so our stance on that has been that one is that we are being told all the time that we are poor in education, according to the global statistics, the UN and World Bank statistics. And so we say that we may be poor in education, which means poor in school infrastructure and enrollments, and poor on the global global education test scores. But we say that there's a word in Hindi called shiksha. So we're rich in shiksha. Our informal learning ecologies are so rich so our approach is actually to start to see those, revalue those, reclaim those in our lives, and actually help kids escape from these four walls of a narrowly confined school education and reconnect to all of the rich learning resources and sources of wisdom, practical skills that exist in their communities and are very much connected to their local economies.
Could you give an example of that? And is that child then going to be doomed to poverty, to not being able to have a job in the future?
Yeah, so my favorite example is actually, I'm often accused of saying that kids, or misconstrued as saying that kids should all be goat herders, because a lot of kids in their communities take care of the goats and they go out 3-4 hours a day. They oftentimes ditch school because they're out with the goats and all of that. And so I used to get very defensive around that. It's like, oh no, I'm not a bad person. I want these kids to have opportunities and choices and things in the future. I know choices are bad. But, so I went very defensive about it. And then I said, why don't I go and actually spend time with these kids who are goat herders? And I found they had a fantastic knowledge around their own wild foods that exist in their communities. They knew about the forest, they knew about how to take care of goats, and they knew far more about management than most MBA students even about. I challenge a lot of Indian MBAs to come and manage a group of 20 goats for a day. And I thought that, maybe these kids don't know how to spell G-O-A-T, but they know a phenomenal amount about how goats are and how their ecosystems are and how their communities are connected to that. And so I think that those are the processes we're trying to recover and revalue, saying that they're not wasting their time not learning anything by herding goats. They actually know far more than the kids who are sitting in a classroom and only learning reading. Even I asked them, I'll just share a small thing, I asked them, how do you tell? Like, looking at 20 goats, how can you tell these are your goats and not somebody else's goats? And they picked up, some of the kids picked up a piece of paper and they showed me some writing and said, how do you tell the difference between these letters? So you need to learn how to read your goats also.
So, Bayo, the West is often considered the wealthy part of the world, and yet, from reading some of your material, I get the feeling that we are impoverished in some very important areas. And I'm wondering, when you come back and forth, where do you see the real wealth in both the West and in your communities?
Well, there's a tongue-in-cheek saying where I come from, that when you fall in love, there's a tongue-in-cheek saying where I come from. It says, when you fall in love, look where you land. And it's like, it's advice for young men who are about to get married. It just so happens that right now, the wealth that we hold as a people, as a culture, in terms of our language, the way we see the world, the way we associate with the non-human world, not as a mute, Newtonian assemblage of atoms, but a beautiful parliament of spirits. Now that wealth is disappearing every day because we're blind and because we're falling in love with a single story. And that single story is the story that if we do not speak English or if we do not have accents like people that come from the West, then we're not worth it and we don't matter. And if we don't go to school or if we don't have jobs, then we're useless. And so our whole landscapes are being destroyed, not just in terms of urbanization, but because there's an epistemic infiltration of a single story coming in and destroying everything that we've held there for thousands of years. And so yes, the wealth is there, but the wealth is going under. It's being silenced by that single story. And my work is about speaking about this wealth and saying, look, we're not as poor as we think we are.
So can you give me one example of that? Can you give me one example of that? Is there a particular thing that is being lost when you think of that wealth being lost, that you're trying to get people to value enough to hold on to?
I'll just tap into one of the conversations I had with a shaman priest. He said, I was speaking with one of them, and here's this very well-trained, schooled psychologist. From my doctorate degree, I was trying to build another model, a different psychiatric model, to tell the world that this is the way we see illness and wellness and well-being and aliveness. And my whole efforts failed because I went to this guy and sat before him and I said, if you hear voices, there are no people there, you hear voices. Isn't that a bad thing? I had to bring it down to the simplest way I could put it. Isn't that a bad thing to hear voices? And the guy said, why would you lock people up because they hear voices? It's probably the case that spirits are trying to tell you good things. So you should open your ears and hear them. And we tend to see it in the discipline as something evil, as something bad, as something that has to be medicated. But I think what they were trying to impress me with was a vision of a world that is much more alive than we see it today. And that's what I think we're losing. This beautiful, sensuous relationship with a world that is always there with us, that shares the same skin, so to speak, and whispers in our ears and tells us things to do. Those shaman priests would bend down and listen to plants, and the plants would speak to them about what they should do or what they should not do. And I think we're losing that world because we're converting everything to a single metric system, a single way of knowing.
Thank you. Was the moment when you took the elders from Ladakh and showed them an American nursing home and their dismay at seeing how American elders are treated. So I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit about what it means to be an elder in the countries that you're spending so much time on.
Yeah, that is one of the greatest poverties in the West, is this cutting off of intergenerational relationships. And it's an all-pervasive poverty because it starts already with young children. And what I came to realize in these other cultures, and especially after so many years of living with the Ladakhis, is that when you grow up in an intergenerational community, what happens is fundamentally different from what happens when we segregate children into separate age groups. If you imagine having 31-year-olds in the same room all day, as you will do in a nursery, reach out a hand and help the other child walk. They're all struggling to walk. So you're growing up in a universe that feels as though human beings are competitive by nature. What I experienced out there, and I have to say, you know, when it was really functioning as part of a whole way of life, as a whole economic system, it was truly harmonious and really worked. And that was that every child was learning and teaching virtually their whole, as they grew up. The 3-year-old could help and would help the 1-year-old. The 5-year-old boy would often carry the infant. And I came to see that not as some kind of child labor, but actually a remarkable way that it had, again, multiple functions. Because what we've discovered is that young men growing up, literally nurturing babies, will have a different hormonal balance from men who never had the privilege and the wealth of nurturing and looking after younger children and younger animals, as they did in all of these cultures. So, and I also realized that as a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old, you never say, oh, I'm not as good as my 8-year-old brother, I should be able to run as fast, I'm no good. But in this leveled monoculture, this is what happens. You have to be as good as, and you're suddenly subjected to this intense competition to prove that you're as bright and you can run as fast. Basically, that you're exactly the same as. And of course, as an older person, what I discovered was that it keeps you infinitely alive and young to be so deeply connected to the youngest of the youngest. And I'll make a plug for my book. There aren't that many copies available, but Ancient Futures is out there. And on the cover, you'll see this beautiful photo of the great-grandmother and the baby together. And you'll see that, well, some of the aspects of why I just felt they were made for each other. Living together on a daily basis. And by the way, I know that a lot of you out here are as old as I am, and well, I think, yes, quite a few of you, okay? I'm almost 70, so, but I find now when I'm with young children, you know, sometimes only for half a day, I feel exhausted afterwards. We're talking about a very different quality of being together when it's part of an entire way of life. Just want to make that point. So don't feel guilty if you're not this beatific great-grandmother or grandmother. We're living in a very different structure. But I do think we can start making steps towards rebuilding those relationships, renewing them. Gradual steps, but it's really important we start the journey. One of the things I discovered, as you see on the cover of the book, the young baby and the great-grandmother, they're both toothless, they're both hairless, and they both walk very, very slowly. And seeing them hand in hand, going off to the loo, to the toilet together, and eating together slowly, it was like, it's a gift, it's a wealth. Yes, thank you.
A little bit of sort of mini immersion in some of the really sweet things about this movement and about the philosophy. I want to raise some doubts now, just mix things up a little bit. So, Manish, let me start with you. And the question I have for you is that, that in my experience, people who have spent significant amounts of time outside their own communities often gain some wisdom, some humility about who they are, what their own culture is, and a kind of breadth and an ability to reflect back on their own assumptions about the world. And if we take localization really seriously, are we saying that we don't want to have that sort of travel take place and that sort of broadening that goes with it?
I think that I agree with you that these kinds of interactions, cross-cultural interactions, are essential for our growth. And I think that, you know, I was once with some students in Ladakh actually many years ago, and they started saying, well, we need globalization because how will we communicate? We need internet, how will we communicate with other people? And so I said, we've actually forgotten our own histories. that for thousands of years we've actually been having all these kinds of communications. The Silk Route was one way that people spread ideas and communicated, and this was all by foot, you know, and there's all these beautiful routes you can follow around Asia where people were, you know, from the Middle East all the way to Southeast Asia, where people were communicating, and flow of ideas and reflections and travel and everything was actually happening even before we had all of these modern, you know, inventions and all of that. So I think there's a huge possibility for that to still happen even if we talk about localization. And we need to actually think about how to go deeper within that, because also we have a lot of, for example, where I live in India, we have a lot of students from the US come. And over the years I've seen that they have become more and more very comfortable being in a bubble. You know, they come to India for the ethnic experience, you know, and yet they like to go to the Starbucks. They like to go to the, you know, the same kinds of, you know, Western-like hangouts to actually stay in their comfort zones. And I think, so when we're even thinking about this, we need to actually see how do we push ourselves to come out of those comfort zones actually, and actually connect with real people and real communities and things. Otherwise, the brands are so enticing all the time, right? And it's somehow that they've gotten in our heads that there's some kind of comfort food, comfort place, and all of that kind of things. And so actually these interactions, how much are we actually even going out and really expanding ourselves? That I would raise a question for us to reflect on.
Great question, and I would think this, we could say the same thing about reaching out within our own cities, because there's so much diversity within our cities here in the United States. Just going to a different community can also have that. Michael, we're here in Portland, which is the headquarters of Nike, and in the Northwest, of course, there's a huge emphasis on international trade, and especially trade with Asia. And this region has gotten quite wealthy as a result of that. There's a lot of jobs, there's a lot of people are very happy with that situation. How do you suggest, when you talk to people who are benefiting from that, what do you say to them about what they have to gain by shifting over to a localized economy?
Right, so it's an interesting dance that we're all doing. And I think that there are two really important strands to localization that are different. So one is about ownership, and one is about proximity. And ownership is that we should try to have as much of our economy as possible in locally owned businesses. And you know, to everyone who loves Nike, I would just say, think of all of the additional community benefits you would have had if Nike were a locally owned company rather than publicly traded. You would have had even more benefits of that company growing indigenously here. Proximity is really about, you know, the distance between a producer and a consumer, farm to table kind of thing. And I think most of us understand, and even economists understand, that prosperity is rooted in a diverse economy. That any economy that is rooted in a single industry, like Detroit based on autos, is setting itself up for some kind of catastrophe in the future. So this was a basic lesson of Jane Jacobs. We want to replace imports, become more diverse, but not as a way of withdrawing from the global economy, but as a way of participating in the global economy from a position of strength. So personally, I think that smart localization embraces trade, but you try to do absolutely as much as you can locally first, and then from that position of strength, that position of wealth, then the things you can't get, you engage in trade. And the way that you support partners internationally, and this is a key thing, that none of us should feel comfortable just localizing Portland and that's the end of the story. Our mission has to be to empower as many people in the world to achieve as high a degree of localization as possible. And you know what's weird and paradoxical about that?
if that happens, everyone gets wealthier, and there may be more trade. Localization may be a way of getting more trade, which actually should make us a little bit nervous, which is why we have to go back to this idea of a carbon tax and make sure that the things we trade are worth a lot, but don't carry a lot of embedded energy and materials and so forth.
More trade.
There would be a lot more trade because there would be a lot more traders, but the distances would generally be much, much shorter. And so to a great extent, the trade could be literally within Portland or within the region, but you're talking about many more players, many more producers, many more jobs, because you're talking about choosing smaller scale, which offers meaningful work opportunities, because you're talking about a really job-rich, what in Italy we talk about the artisan economy, where people can enjoy the beauty of more handmade objects, be they ceramic pots, be they clothes, be they handmade cheeses, you know, and the actual work in that small scale is so much more enjoyable. So yes, more trade, more players, more businesses, but far lower footprint, because the distances would not be what we have today. And I just do quickly want to remind people what we show in our film, The Economics of Happiness, which is that in this corporate-run global trade system, countries are routinely importing and exporting the same product. Literally, the US exports as much beef as it imports, the UK exports as much butter and milk as it imports, and we're talking about, you know, potatoes, we're talking about water, we're talking about used batteries, plastic waste being flown across the planet. We're also talking about shrimp being flown from Thailand, from the UK to Thailand to be peeled and flown back again. Apples flown to South Africa to be washed and waxed, flown back again. We don't hear about this, but I would so like to see Greenpeace and 350.org bring in this discussion when we talk about global warming. Let's not just talk about changing our light bulbs and driving our cars less. Let's start talking about the systems of production and consumption. The system, not just the isolated individual consumer.
So, Bayo, when I think of the relationship between the United States and Nigeria, I often think about the Shell Oil Company, which is actually based in the US, but they're based in the West, and the devastation that's occurred as a result of the oil exploitation in the Niger Delta. So that's one of the ways I think of the relationship between the West and Nigeria. And then I know a lot of other people will say, well, when we have trade with Nigeria, it's benefiting people, it's bringing them up from poverty. So how do you see it? Is your message, you all ought to leave us alone? Is that what we really want?
I debated whether to do this, so this is taking off on a different tangent, but I'll resume that.
Okay.
The mic? Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay, so as we all know, 300 girls were abducted from their schools about 300 days ago, and we still haven't found them. At the last Economics of Happiness conference in Bangalore, I asked everyone to do this. It's so unfortunate that in this edition, they're still missing, and they haven't come home yet. And I just want to invite everyone to hold a space of silence, and I will be standing up just for 10 seconds and invite you to do so with me, just to hold that space for them again. I'm so ashamed that we're still doing this now. May they come home soon. Thank you very much. So, yes, I think Manish has answered that question a little bit in saying it's not about closing our doors and saying we don't want you. That's what the terrorist group, Boko Haram, is all about. Like, Western education is sinful. And so we close our doors and we use violence as a means to coerce people into adopting our own ideologies. But that's not what we're about. It's about, see, there's a power inequity here. There is a situation where we are being slowly hollowed out, where our own stories no longer matter, our own voices no longer matter, our cultures are being slowly, losing their powers slowly. And basically what we're about is inviting conversations with people that are different from us, but in a situation where we can actually be equal partners and not just vassal to something that is superior to us. And so, yeah, I think that's the way I'll put it, that localization is a permission to be me, is a permission to have my own voice, to have my own interests at heart. It's not a closing of the doors, it's actually an opening of the doors and inviting people to share at my table, but not to come as kings and colonizers, but people, friends, guests.